play a little bit today. I was participating in a project to do with the maternal and performance, and I'm doing a lot of work on the politics of motherhood and a politics motherwise for my next book. And there was a space in the Nina program when I do a lot about the relationship between politics and economics, and I thought, you know, let's play with democracy motherwise. And I think one of the things that, and this comes from an ongoing collaboration with some sisters in Brazil. So Sandra is the key person, and Claudiano, who's not on this, and Mila. And I want to try and see you as I'm speaking. And it's really, I think a preoccupation for me is that sometimes when we talk about like new economies, there's a separation reproduced between the political and the economic, in the sense that it's assumed that almost the structures of governance and polity and state can stay the same. And we can kind of change some economic policies, or we can change some forms of producing. And for me, in the kinds of work I do with women in movement, often Indigenous and Black and Mestiza mixed women in movement in the Global South, including in Australia, is that these two are deeply interrelated, and the possibilities of being able to construct an economy otherwise, which is kind of based on justice and healing justice work and restoration and plurality in its deepest sense of the word, necessarily implies a shift in the relationships of power around authority, around political subjecthood, around what we understand citizenship to be, around what we understand sovereignty to be, which obviously is so central here in these lands if we're talking about new economies and new polities. So I want to play with this around this idea of otherwise but motherwise. And why I want to do that is because there's a group called Mãos que Criam, and their Hands That Create, and it's a women's collective which forms part of a settlement in Sara, which is northeast Brazil, a settlement of the Movimento Sem Terra, and the Movimento Sem Terra, that many of you will know, are the landless workers movement. And this is a movement of the pause, and it's a movement that's made up of campesino, like peasant, indigenous strands of culture and practices and subjects. And this particular cooperative, Mãos que Criam, are important to focus on, I think, because they take us to the space of social reproduction. So they take us to the space of what is wrong with the way that social reproduction, so the reproduction of life, education, health, care, housing, food, are organised currently, and the violences and harms that are embodied within this. But they also take us to a reproduction otherwise. And interestingly, that is, I think, quite emergent in many movements who are politicising the fault lines of current modes of economic and political and social life. Women and mothers and aunties and grandmothers are at the heart of this, because I would argue, and others argue this, it's not like particularly unique to what I'm saying, is that social reproduction is double-sided. So on one hand, in kind of patriarchal capitalist coloniality, it is the site of invisibilized labor, often feminized labor, which is devalued and not seen as a site of value or of knowledge or of a capacity from which to organize. But on the other side, when it's politicized, as these women are doing, it can become a site of producing our communities in life nurturing ways, as opposed to anti-life extractionist ways. And so in order to get at this involves turning a lens towards the threads that are often invisibilized, even within movement literatures, even within discussions of kind of radical politics, of what's happening in this construction of, like, you know, these intimacies, these ecologies of intimacy, right? These ecologies of care and reciprocity and recognition. And so that it's important to zoom in and center away from the margins of what we might understand to be what's important when thinking about the conditions of possibility and the realities of an economy otherwise, and actually center these kinds of everyday practices and webs of reproducing life otherwise. And that when we do this, we see that there are emergent forms of economies, but they're social economies, and they're weaved around care and madre tierra, black country, and community, and in many ways open up spaces and are constructed through other forms of making decisions, other forms of legitimacy, other forms of power that are recognized, other forms of knowledges that are recognized, which has been covered. I missed some of yours, Sonia, because I had to go for a little walk. So I got some of yours, but when I was listening to Liz, I could see there are many elements, right, that speak to practices in different places that we can pull out. So they emerge really on the fault lines of these extractive, I would say probably political economies. I haven't had time to review this. I did this in another context, but political economies, because I don't want to separate the political and the economic. And I do want to suggest that there needs to be fundamental shifts in both to enable these kind of democracy motherwise that is deeply both economic, social and political. And so they kind of emerge on these fault lines of the sacrificial zones of people and places, where in the context that they're in, you have huge agricultural agribusiness, and you have fault lines of, you know, alliances of government, multinational, military, protecting and supporting the agribusiness, who is deeply unregulated, and then communities being dispossessed or losing their land or having their waterways poisoned or having the airways full of kind of chemicals that have been sprayed from the plains to make sure that, you know, you can grow rapidly and multiple times, soy, for example, and, you know, having their kids with skin eczema and breathing issues and having their ecologies harmed. And so you have this fault line, and you have resistances to this from these communities. So these are deeply politicized forms. They're forms that emerge through the experience of these harms of the way the contemporary political economy is organized. And you can see in this picture, this is a circle of remembering. And this is a circle of remembering the lives lost of their compañeros, of their kin, who, because often these fault lines are deeply militarized, deeply policed. So the lives lost because of assassinations or because of massacres, or because of illness as a result of these contaminations. And the lives lost in terms of country, in terms of madre tierra. And so you have an honoring. You have an honoring and a remembering. So in these practices of constructing, let's call it this democracy otherwise, you have an embrace of those territories of being in our emotions, in our embodiment, that are often rendered illegitimate in hegemonic or dominant forms of political economy. So the story, grief as a collective political act, embodiment with spirit and land, becomes a really legitimate form of knowledge, but also a legitimate way to weave other forms of connection through care. And this is important because this is, I think, very key in how we imagine and how we might embody these other possibilities. And to consider these kinds of processes, you can consider them as pedagogical processes of learning and unlearning processes. And as part of this expanded democracy or politics otherwise, there is a politicization of social reproduction. So in this case, there's a politicization and a contestation of the production of food, of agriculture, away from agribusiness towards different traditions that weave in the multiple histories of the participants in the settlement, and that are combined in kind of radical education projects around eco-ecology, and that use radical methods of education, and that mean that decisions around what is being produced and created are taken in a circular manner. So there's many complexities to this, and it's very placed, this movement, but this particular cooperative, so it's taken in a kind of assembly manner and taken in consideration of responsibilities to Madre Tierra, responsibilities to each other, and there is kind of a distribution of labors, but there's a collectivization of mothering. What do I mean by that? So there's not just the production of the produce as separate from what happens in broader aspects of care. So there's also like collective forms of childcare, yeah? And children become part of this radical political process and become part of these agricultural ecological learnings. But also, I can't remember what I was going to say on the other thing. But fundamentally, this is about a redistribution of power and a recognition of the knowledges and the wisdoms that each participant brings. So there's often a space for like telling of those stories and for sharing and recounting knowledges of planting, right? Knowledges of seasons, knowledges of particular fruit or particular vegetables. And so this collectivization of motherhood is really what I'm using it to signify is not just the body of the mother. I also am talking about the non-maternal subject, and what does it mean to co-construct an ethics of care that is both embodied and material in enabling us to reproduce our communities in healthy ways of embedded within well-being. As part of this, so there's the embodied, the emotional, the radical education, the politicization of social reproduction, new forms of democratic life, which are deeply economic, is the spiritual. So connection to Madre Tierra, connection to both indigenous and kind of hybrid forms of Catholicism and peasant cultural practice become really, really important. And this is often organized in this particular movement around a practice called Mystica. And I think I might be running out of time. So Mystica, and here you have a little altar and you have a remembrance altar at the front. And again, what you will have at the beginning and opening of any meeting, so a meeting like this, or a kind of more formal political meeting to talk about strategies between groups, you would have a representation of story and a representation of survivance and of dignity. And that might be an enactment, a drama, that might be a song, that might be a poem. And often there is then an embrace, like a collective embrace. And that this is also viewed as really important in the creation of those ecologies of care, and in the sustainability in a more radical sense than how it's often co-opted, to the nurturance of these relationships together, of the complexity of ourselves as beings, right, in relationship. And here we see they're just having a meeting. So it's one of their meetings. There's often circular, you can see it's often circular. When we talk about politics or decision making, when we talk about education, there's also a disruption of those borders between functions. So, the current way we organize society separates the political and the economic, or says it does, although they're deeply intertwined, separates education from life, separates politics from struggle and embodiment. So even just the fact you sit and you have discussions and you're outside often, or the radical education itself happens through the planting and the telling of story, right? And the remembrance and the meeting each other is itself part of this democracy motherwise. And so I think that's enough. That's what I wanted to talk about, really. The importance of foregrounding politics as struggle, politics as the affirmative, of centering subjects who've been historically on the margin, so raced women from the South, and of centering an approach that takes seriously the need to radically restructure power in all its manifestations, and to embrace the complexity of our being otherwise together, and how useful it might be to name this a democracy motherwise. There you go. Thank you.